Up next, we have current student Jeff Iovannone, HPP class of 2023. Jeff is a public historian and historic preservationist from Buffalo, New York. His areas of interest include LGBTQ heritage preservation, connections between preservation, public history, and social justice, and the use of preservation planning to benefit historically marginalized communities. Jeff is currently president of Cornell's Preservation Studies student organization and co-founder of Gay Places, a joint project with Preservation Buffalo Niagara that documents and provides education around LGBTQ historic sites in Western New York. Jeff's presentation will focus on the Firebrand Books building in Ithaca, New York. Ithaca is considered one of the most progressive LGBTQ-friendly communities in upstate New York, and recent census data indicates that Tompkins County has more LGBTQ people per capita than the national average. Yet, Ithaca has no officially designated LGBTQ landmarks or historic sites. This presentation will make a case as to why the Firebrand Books building, located at 143 East State Street on the Commons, should be Ithaca's first local LGBTQ landmark. Firebrand Books, a small, award-winning feminist and lesbian press, was founded in Ithaca in 1984 by Nancy K. Bariano, as part of the broader second-wave feminist and women in print movements. Firebrand's office was located on the second story of 143 East State Street from 1984 until 2000. In addition to a case for landmark designation, the presentation will also argue for the installation of a historic plaque on the Commons that marks and interprets the Firebrand Books building as an integral part of Ithaca's LGBTQ heritage. Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to pop a link into the chat. That's a Google Doc that has resources for Ithaca LGBTQ history that I'm going to refer to throughout the presentation. There we go. Okay. Okay, so the Firebrand Books building, which I think should be Ithaca's first official LGBTQ landmark. So as we know as preservation planners, every building has a story to tell, but it's not until relatively recently that we've used the built environment to tell LGBTQ stories and to also conserve aspects of the built environment specifically for their connection to LGBTQ heritage. It's not really until the founding of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project in 2015, who I'm also doing my internship with this summer, and then the LGBTQ theme study from the National Park Service in 2016. It's also worth pointing out that 2016 is also when the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village becomes a national monument. But like much of the broader field of LGBTQ history, much of the work that's been done and what's been documented and landmarked has tended to focus on New York City, San Francisco, Los Angeles, so large cities on the east or west coast. And my interest, at least at present, is really LGBTQ sites in upstate New York. I'm from Buffalo and have done a lot of work to document sites there. But I thought I would talk about something in Ithaca for this presentation, and a building that's on the Commons that we probably all have some familiarity with or have walked by at one point or another. And as Michelle pointed out in her introduction, Ithaca has a really rich LGBTQ heritage. The second gay student organization in the country, the Student Homophile League, was founded at Cornell. It was second only to Columbia University. Ithaca is also the place where the first gay student sit-in in the country happens at Maury's Bar in College Town, which is pictured in the bottom of the article that I have here from the Cornell Daily Sun, an invisible minority, gay Cornellians. And in Danby, New York in the 1970s, there was also a gay commune called Lavender Hill. And it's members of the Lavender Hill commune that then found the Moosewood Collective and the Moosewood Restaurant. A group of students from Ithaca College in 2019 also made a Ithaca LGBTQ history walking tour that won an award from Historic Ithaca and also from the American Historical Association. But when I was looking at the sites that are on this tour, I noticed that nothing is officially landmarked. There's no historic plaques or markers that are designating any of these sites. And in the link that I put in the chat, there's a link to the tour if anyone wants to check it out. And it's also accessible through an app that was developed in Ithaca called Pocket Sites, which is a walking tour app. But none of these places that are on the tour are locally landmarked, nor are they made visible through anything like a historic plaque or a marker. And so I think that if we are going to landmark one of these sites, or in terms of what is the most significant, I think that that would be the Firebrand Books building, which, as Michelle mentioned, has alternatively been known as the Andrus Block or the Home Dairy Building. It's located at 143 East State Street on the Commons. It's a contributing resource to the Ithaca Downtown Historic District, which is a National Register district, but it's not locally landmarked. It's a late 19th century brick commercial row building that has Italian influence, and it was built in 1872. So my initial idea for this project when I started doing this research was to research the building to make a case to the city that there should be a historic plaque that's talking about the significance of Firebrand Books that was either on the building or in the Commons. And when I talked to Brian McCracken, who many of us know, the city preservation planner, he suggested instead that I just do a local landmark nomination for the building. So that's what I did. And the building really has two periods of significance, and they're both related to its association to publishing and print culture in Ithaca. So one of the things that I found in my research that was really cool was that from 1872 to 1929, the building housed a prominent local publisher and bookseller, Andrus and Church. So the building was actually built to house a publisher. And then secondly, and I think most importantly, from 1984 to 2000, the second floor was home to the office of Firebrand Books, which was a nationally renowned and award-winning small lesbian and feminist press that was founded by Ithacan Nancy K. Bariano. And so I think we could make the case under the National Register criterion, which the city of Ithaca uses for local landmarks, that it's significant under A, B, and C. So under A, for its connection to the second wave feminist movement, in particular a subsect of that movement called the Women in Print movement, Under B for Nancy Bariano in her role as a publisher, an editor, also as a local activist. And then also I think for C, that it really embodies a late 19th century commercial row building, and that the building itself conveys the prominence that publishing played in Ithaca at the time it was constructed. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the history of 143 East State Street. So in 1824, William Andrus Sr., who is a traveling bookseller and auctioneer from Connecticut, comes to Ithaca, and he establishes a printing and bookselling business with Ebenezer Mack, who was the original proprietor of the Ithaca Journal. And at that time, the firm was known as Mack and Andrus. And William Andrus was referred to by the Ithaca Journal as, quote, one of the early settlers of Ithaca, who played an important part in the development of the community and Cornell University. So in 1831, Mack and Andrus purchased a 3-story brick building that was then located at 143 East State Street. And that building was destroyed in a fire in 1871, and it was replaced by the present building that we see here in 1872. And if we look at, so before I get there, and then the building goes through a variety of different permutations in terms of different partners coming in and out of the firm, but by 1872, it's Andrus and Church. And Andrus at this time is William Andrus Jr., and then also William Church. And if we look at the Sanborn map from 1888 that shows the section of East State Street that later becomes the Commons. And then if we zoom in further, we can see that the building, which was then designated as 43, is labeled as books. And then we can also see in the rear the Andrus and Church printing office. And local Ithaca historian D. Morris Kurtz described the first floor of the Andrus Block building as a sales room for books, stationery, wallpaper, etc., carrying a large stock and fine assortment of everything in this line, especially publications in demand by students at the university. And at the time, Andrus and Church was one of the most prominent businesses in Ithaca because in addition to printing regular materials like books and pamphlets, they were also printing all of Cornell's publications and materials that students needed for courses. And this shows the fact that Andrus and Church were able to finance in 1872 a building that has a sophisticated architectural composition, that has a lot of fine detailing, shows the prominence of publishing and bookselling as commercial enterprises in Ithaca in the late 19th century. So in 1929, the building transitions and becomes the Home Dairy Company, which is a chain of cafeteria-style restaurants and bakeries that specialized in quote-unquote old-fashioned home-cooked foods that was founded by Frank E. Allen, who's a businessman from the Rochester, New York area. And by the mid-20th century, he owned 28 home dairy locations throughout upstate New York and also Pennsylvania. Some changes were made to the building in 1929 that we can still see today. So when it was constructed in 1872, it originally had a cast iron facade on the first story storefront. That was replaced in 1929 with an oak wood facade. We also see prism glass being added in the transom area of the first story storefront. And also the gilt lettered signboard as well that says Home Dairy Company. And the section of East State Street that the building is located on becomes what is today the Commons in 1874. It was the first pedestrian shopping mall in New York State, and this happened as part of then Mayor Ed Conley's plan to quote unquote make Ithaca happen again. That was his campaign slogan when he ran for mayor. So here's Ed Conley posing in the newly constructed Commons in 1974. And then in 1984, as I mentioned, the second floor becomes the office of Firebrand Books. And here's a picture of two of the press's interns working in the office, and we can see on the wall the Firebrand Books banner. So the reason that Firebrand emerges at this time is a product of the broader second wave feminist movement and also more specifically the women in print movement. So if we look at the second wave feminist movement in the United States, we can kind of broadly divide it into two different ideologies. Liberal feminism, where women really wanted to integrate into existing social institutions, and then radical feminism, where women wanted to really radically restructure institutions, create new institutions, and change the structure of society. And the women in print movement really fits within the radical tradition of second wave feminism, more specifically Marxist feminism, in that women really wanted to create their own institutions in terms of printing, book selling, distribution, because at the time, mainstream publishers are not publishing anything by women authors, LGBTQ authors, authors of color. So the women in print movement was really about women seizing the means of production along every aspect of print culture to bring women's voices to the forefront. And I think the historian Trish Travis's definition of the women in print movement is worth quoting at length here. So she says, a product of second wave feminism, the women in print movement was an attempt by a group of allied practitioners to create an alternative communication circuit, a woman-centered network of readers and writers, editors, printers, publishers, distributors, and retailers through which ideas, objects, and practices flowed in a continuous and dynamic loop. The movement's goals were nothing short of revolutionary. It aimed to capture women's experiences and insights in durable, even beautiful printed forms through a communications network free from patriarchal and capitalist control. By doing so, participants believed they would not only create a space of freedom for women, but would also and ultimately change the dominant world outside that space. And one of the centerpieces of the women in print movement was 3 national conferences that were held in Omaha, Nebraska in 1978, Washington, D.C. in 1981, and San Francisco, California in 1985. And these conferences were not so much about promoting authors or books, but about sharing knowledge and skills among women who are involved in the movement. And Nancy K. Bariano, the founder of Firebrand, is very much involved in the larger WIP movement. And then we see that translating in the local level with her founding Firebrand in Ithaca. And to Trish Travis's point about this communication circuit that we see in Ithaca in the 1970s through the early 1990s, there was also a women's bookstore called Smedley's that was located at 307 West State Street. And so we see the publishers that are publishing the books by women, and then the bookstores, the women's bookstores that are actually selling the books and getting them in the hands of women readers. Okay, so let's talk a bit about Nancy Bariano and Firebrand specifically. So Nancy Bariano is originally from New York City, and she moves to Ithaca in the 1960s when her then husband secured a teaching position in Cornell's College of Engineering. She becomes involved in the local anti-war movement, also welfare organizing, and was an advisor to a welfare rights group, but she wasn't initially involved in the women's movement or in gay liberation. But that changes after institutional changes that happen at Cornell, particularly with the takeover of Willard Straight Hall by the Afro-American Society on April 18th of 1969. And so after this, Cornell develops a human affairs program, which allows community members to teach classes about social justice that students can take for credit. And Nancy Bariano taught a course on the politics and economics of the American welfare system. And then several of the women students that she has in class become her peers and bring her into the women's movement and then into the LGBTQ movement. She divorces her husband and comes out as a lesbian. And then she's working at another local press called Crossing Press that was based in Trumansburg. And even though she helps to bring major authors to the press and publish their work, they fire her and she's really angry, and she decides that she's going to found her own lesbian and feminist publishing house in Ithaca, which she does in 1984. And the second floor office space of 143 East State Street had recently been rehabilitated. She really wants to make a splash and have Firebrand at a prominent location on the Commons, so that building is a natural fit for what she wants to do with the press. And Firebrand ends up being a really significant small publishing house for a variety of different reasons that I've outlined here. So first, at the Women in Print conferences that I mentioned, there's a lot of discussion about women of color feeling excluded from the broader movement. Bariano founds Firebrand with an explicitly anti-racist sensibility. She publishes a lot of work by women of color, lesbians of color. She also wasn't picky about the genres that she published. So she published work that was literary, that was theoretical, that was more popular, to appeal to a really broad base of readers. The proximity to Cornell really helps to elevate the status of the press. And it was quite common for authors that Firebrand published to come and speak at the university, and then they would speak then at other places in Ithaca, like the Smedley's bookstore or at the Unitarian Universalist Church. Over its time in business, Firebrand wins multiple awards, both the authors and the books, and also Nancy Bariano herself as a publisher. in particular through the organization Lambda Literary. And between 84 and 2000, Firebrand wins more Lambda Literary Awards than any other press. And the press is also able to last for as long as it does, to 2000, when a lot of other small feminist press are folding during the 1980s and 1990s, because Bariano moves from publishing works that have exclusively lesbian and feminist content to what I call more queer titles or books that are looking at gender and sexuality more broadly. And due to changes in the publishing industry, so large presses starting to publish more women writers, LGBTQ work, and also the rise of large chain stores like Borders and Barnes and Noble. Unfortunately, Nancy Bariano has to close the press in 2000. And in an article that appeared in the Ithaca Journal, written by Stephen Landesman about Bariano's retirement, he describes Firebrand Books as, quote, a widely renowned press and, quote, one of the most prestigious lesbian, gay, and feminist publishers in the world. So I think this is an especially significant resource. And for that reason, I think the building should not only be locally landmarked, but there also needs to be a historic plaque on the Commons that is reinterpreting the building as the Firebrand Books building, so that everyone knows this history. And I have to give a lot of credit to my colleague, Angela Fernandez here, who came up with this, or who did this design for me. I have a lot of ideas, but I don't have any design skill. So Angela very nicely took my ideas for what I thought the marker should look like and made it a reality. And just to talk about a little bit of the symbolism here, going from top to bottom, we have the pink triangle with the city of Ithaca seal in it. The pink triangle is a symbol that has long-time significance within the LGBTQ movement. And the Women in Print movement also used a triangle with a fountain pen in the center as their logo. Then we have the rainbow border. And of course, the rainbow is significant because of the rainbow flag, symbol of LGBTQ rights and liberation, that first premiered in San Francisco in 1978 for San Francisco Gay Freedom Day. The flag was designed by Gilbert Baker. And then we obviously have the Firebrand Books logo, which is the little dragon character, and then the sample text that I wrote for the marker. And I also wanted to create something that the city of Ithaca could potentially use as a template for other LGBTQ historic markers in the future. Okay, and I will conclude there, and I would love to answer some questions.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that really, really informative presentation. I'm sure that we've all walked past the Firebrand Books building on the Common countless times, and I certainly didn't realize the depth of history related to local print culture and LGBTQ history in Ithaca. So thank you for that. Let me see if we've got any questions that have come up in the chat yet. Joseph asked, in your research, did you uncover any significant history associated with other building owners or tenants?
In terms of the building itself, not really. I mean, the first floor has always functioned as a commercial space, and then the upper stories has always been office spaces. So a variety of different local business owners. One thing that I will also point out is the adjacent building. So to the west is William Henry Miller building. It was historically known as the Sage Block. So it was the office of Henry Sage, the first 2 floors. And then on the 3rd story was where Miller had his architectural office. And at first, I thought that Miller might have been the architect for the Firebrand Books building, but I can't find any evidence of that. So.
Ashima asked, what were some uses of the building in between your 2 periods?
Oh, so it was the home dairy from 1929 to 1997, and then the upper floors were rented out for a variety of different local businesses.
Do you have any other questions from the audience? Michael?
Jeff, who cleaned up the building after Home Depot left? Do you know who became involved with the refitting of it?
So after Home Dairy, so you're asking after
Yes.
1997?
Yeah.
I do know. Let me just take a look at my notes so I'm not going to get this wrong. Okay, so it was the Averys who were the owners of the building, and they also operated Home Dairy. In 2003, they sold it to Thomas Rivera. He owned the building until 2012, when then it was sold to the 12 tribes who currently own it. And I think, as some of us might remember, in the first story, they had a cafe that was called the Mate Factor. And then now they're presumably remodeling it into a different restaurant space.
Well, the reason I asked was to also ask Barbara Ebert, who's on the call as well. Wasn't Vicky and Sarah somehow involved with the refitting of that at some point? Barb, do you remember?
I do not distinctly remember, but that when you said it, it did sort of ring a bell. And that would also tie into the LGBTQ story.
Yeah.
So you'd have to ask them just directly.
Yeah, I think you can find either Vicky or Sarah. They're both in the broader
Vicky Romanoff Associates.
Right. The reason I remember this is there was still, I think one or two of them, one of the other asked me about the ceiling in the inside, to date the ceiling. And it was a question, I think, of replacing pieces of the ceiling that were not there. And I remember giving them a suggestion that they would look at the St. Louis company that has stamp metal ceiling replacement parts. So all I'm saying, this is what Barbara has mentioned, to the degree that they would have part of that story. Because in many respects, I mean, many people don't understand the history of Vicky and Sarah's contributions to a number. Julie is saying Vicky did a storefront design for Commons on behalf of Historic Ithaca. They should be part, as Julie is saying, as part of this story. Because I know they were both involved with the women who would gather at various restaurants. The story beyond this story is the gathering places that were regular within the community, where they would gather to exchange notes and have meetings and so on and so forth. Part of the, it's not just the place on the commons, but the socializing centers where in effect the discussion took place about what was appropriate, and more particularly where the reviews would take place. I know this by virtue of having visited the same restaurants at the very same time. And you know, whether I was part of the discussion or not, incidentally, you know, I was nevertheless aware, and I think other people, I know other restaurateurs were aware of the activity that was taking place. It's somewhat similar to the discussion we had earlier about with Zoe, about where the social activities for the baseball club took place over time, because it's not just one site, but several sites in the social network. Good presentation, though. Delighted to see it all come together.
Thank you.
Looks like Rachel's got her hand up.
Thanks. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation. And as I put in the chat, I had a student who just graduated a couple of weeks ago who did his capstone, MLA capstone project on the queer history of Syracuse. And one thing that he discovered, I mean, he learned so much and identified so many sites in this city, which was really just astonishing. But one thing that we learned is that our largest historic park, Thorndon Park, actually had a pinetum, a pine collection that was established as an AIDS memorial back in 79, 80, 81, somewhere around there. I think 81. And I was just wondering, and so our landscape students have gone ahead and sort of taken that on with his encouragement, sort of a landscape restoration project of that pinetum part of the park. And I was just wondering if in your work that goes beyond this building, and you said you worked in Buffalo as well, yeah. Have you found other sorts of historic landscapes, knowing that sometimes the buildings disappear, or as you mentioned, you know, the histories of these buildings are hidden from view, but have you found other sorts of public open space or landscapes in your work?
Yes, in Buffalo, we can point to particular parks, some within the Olmsted park system that were known within the community as cruising areas, right, that had that sort of historic significance.
Sure.
And to the extent that Buffalo had a particularly homophobic mayor, Jimmy Griffin, from the late 70s to the early 1990s, who would actually have sections of the trees in the various parks cut down because it was known that gay men were cruising there and wanted to make it easier, right, for the police to be able to regulate that.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. So do you see your work in Ithaca continuing then to incorporate that larger sort of urban fabric or urban landscape, or are you going to be focusing on individual built sites, buildings?
We'll see where it goes. So my primary interest is in Buffalo. I'm going to be doing my thesis on LGBTQ historic sites in Buffalo. This might just be a one-off, but we'll see where it goes. I certainly think there's more work to be done. The students at Ithaca College did an amazing job identifying all of these sites. Mm-hmm. And there's so much more to work with and that we could do beyond the walking tour that they created. So there's a lot of rich history here to explore.
Well, I put my email address in the chat to you. So if you'd get in touch, I'd love to connect you with this recent student. He just started working in Ithaca last week at a new job. So I would
Great.
love to connect you too. Thank you. Great
Thanks,
work.
I would love that.
Great work. Thank you.
I think we've got time for a few more questions. Sherry, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Jeff, thank you for bringing this story forward and broadening our understanding of this particular resource. I know that this property is a contributing resource to the Ithaca Downtown Historic District, but I think the work you're doing points to the importance of updating or producing new National Register nominations. Even, you know, some folks may say, look, it's already a contributing resource in a listed district. Why pursue an individual listing for this? I think the work you're doing shows exactly why individual listings should be pursued, because it broadens our understanding of the importance of that property and the meaning to the community that's associated with it. So thank you for that work.
Thank you.
It looks like
Raise my hand.
Susanna, would you like to go next?
I'm sorry, I was reclining. I have what may seem like an ignorant question, and I don't mean it to be. I ask it sincerely. I think this was so interesting, and of course I sit on the designation committee for the Philadelphia Historical Commission, and of course we are increasingly seeing resources being brought forward and proposed for listing due to their LGBTQ history. My question is, where do you start to look for these stories? I feel like, you know, I've never had the opportunity to work on a historic LGBTQ site, but where does the research begin? I just don't know, and it's my own ignorance. I hope that's not a bad question to ask.
No, that's a great question, right? And like one of the things that we see that's a product of the broader LGBTQ movement is initially, like we're thinking about late 1960s, early 1970s, LGBTQ history is not formally incorporated into academia. It's local people that are doing this and starting archives and local history projects. So I would first look like, is there a local LGBTQ archive where you are, either that's right community associated or with an institution? And if there isn't one, right, is that something that people should be thinking about? And then also, so that, and then for a lot of this, you really have to like get out there and talk to people. And so I think oral history is incredibly significant and connected to LGBTQ historic preservation. You have to get out there and find people in the community and get them talking and listen to their stories, and then learn what are the places, the aspects of the built environment or landscapes that are connected to their story as LGBTQ people.
I just think it's so important because we can't find those stories, right? Unless we know where to look. And so we have to really be thinking about, you know, as you said, right, talking to people and listening and really trying to suss them out so we don't miss them. So that's great. Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk very much, especially since that's one of the buildings I do remember from my time in Ithaca.
Jack mentioned in the chat that one of his favorite aspects of the building was the fenestration composition facing the alley, and was wondering if that feature plays at all into the building.
Yes.
Yes, the alley
go ahead.
itself, and I saw on the old
Yeah.
Sanborn that it was there leading to the sort of an interior court. But I wondered if it was also used, I guess, under as a publishing company and later.
Yes, that's a great observation, because like looking at the Sanborns, I think what we can see is like the alley was used to get from the primary, the building that was the primary retail space to the offices of the publishing firm, the Anderson Church publishing firm, which were located in the rear, and the alley itself, which is now called the Home Dairy Alley, is a part of the National Register district. That's actually the alley is actually the boundary line of the district to the east. So Jack is asking, before researching Firebrand books, was there a building that you fell in love with that sparked your interest in architecture with LGBTQ plus significance? Also, is there a particular structure with a lot of LGBTQI history that you recommend that we research? Great question. Yes, in the Buffalo area, in particular in the town of Clarence, I was researching a local transgender activist from the 1970s, and it turned out that she owned a circa 1830 Greek Revival house, which was one of the early properties in Clarence, and she was using the house as sort of like a safe house where she was having other transgender women stay with her, and she was providing peer counseling services for them. So it was a really great example of how the architectural history and the social history were working together to tell a story. And in terms of particular structures with a lot of LGBTQIA history, I would actually recommend starting with the website of the NYC LGBT Sites Project. They're really leaders in this area, and they set up a great model for documenting these types of sites. And there's close to 400 sites in New York City that they've identified on their website. So, and they have them all curated into different themes. So that's a really excellent place to start if you're interested in the intersection of LGBTQ history and preservation.
Can I ask or say something, one more thing, Jeff?
Yes.
I think that you've actually hit on a really interesting starting point for research into this area, because publications are often the major way that you can connect to an individual's mindset or sexuality, shall we say. And they may not be running around town advertising that they're a member of any particular club or society or dinner group, but they will be more forthcoming in their publications.
Yeah.
And finding the names of people through the publications is another way to connect back to, okay, so we found Mary Smith, and she lived at this particular address and she worked at this particular place, and we know from her writings that she was proposing this particular agenda.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's a really interesting way to go about it. It's definitely something that it sparked a real interest in my mind, because it's like, wow,
Yeah.
that could work. I mean, and then Michael bringing up Vicky and Sarah's work through V. Romanoff and Associates, because someone doing some initial oral history could talk to Vicky and Sarah about the projects they've done and connect to their social network which would also bring you into a broader circle of understanding of a lot of different types of Ithaca natives. So the Ithaca scene. And so from the Ithaca perspective, it's a really good find. I think that's really exciting. Also, there are people that Vicky and Sarah do business with that could put you onto other avenues of exploration, or someone else if you're finished with this. So I don't know what your status is in terms of thesis and all that. So, but it's really, I'm really impressed with the connection way that you made this connection. So good luck with everything.
Thank you.
Let me just add, Jeff, you wouldn't have any idea to understand the deep connections. Vicky and Sarah Vicky moved to Ithaca. She moved there at the behest of Russell Wright, who was one of the early gay men. He was an MRP student who did the first survey of historic sites in the Finger Lakes region. Vicky and Russell were both RISD students. And that's the deeper connection to the preservation. And that has been completely unexplored in the scenario of how it is. Russell Wright could be thought of, he worked for Stu Stein in Providence in the first preservation plan for Providence, the Providence Plan, right? And the reality is that nobody has really quite understood the relationships that existed between the two of them, but they were close friends. And Russell, I believe, as I remember, died of AIDS, but just so that you know, there is a deep and abiding history that we're suggesting here in Ithaca that has to do with publications and has to do with a whole series of contributions that have made the difference.
I think we might take a 5-minute break for our last presentation of the morning, which will be a recap on Work Weekend this year. So you all in about 5 minutes.